I'm with Ben now. I want a divorce. I'm staying in this house with the kids, and you can see them on weekends. Sarah said it like she was reading items off a grocery list. Totally matter of fact. She hadn't even taken off her jacket when she walked in, just tossed her keys on the counter. She'd already received management approval for this plan, apparently, and was just informing me of the new policy. And then she dropped the part that made my blood run cold. She said, "When you move out, Ben's going to move in. My parents will understand that I need support during this transition." I just stared at her for a second, my mind racing. Then I asked the only question that actually mattered. "You're seriously planning to move your boyfriend into your parents' house where our kids sleep?" She actually rolled her eyes like I was being dramatic. She said Ben was great with kids, that Noah already liked him, and this was happening whether I agreed or not. She told me I had until the end of the week to find somewhere else to stay, and she'd already talked to a lawyer about custody arrangements that would give her primary residence. I could see she was expecting me to either explode in anger or crumble emotionally, probably both. But instead, I just walked to our bedroom and started packing a bag. She followed me, looking almost triumphant, thinking she'd finally broken me down. She even started talking about how we'd split holidays and how civil we could keep things if I just cooperated with her timeline. I zipped up the bag, walked back to the living room, and then sat down on the couch, her favorite spot, the one she always jokingly called her throne. She looked genuinely confused. "What are you doing?" she asked. And I told her, very clearly, "I'm not leaving." I said, "I'm not going to vacate this house so you can move another man into the bedrooms where my children sleep. That's absolutely not happening." Her face went from confused to furious in about half a second. She started yelling about how I couldn't stop her, how she'd call the police if I didn't leave, and how her parents would obviously take her side, like they always had throughout our marriage. I let her finish her entire rant without interrupting. And then I said something that made her go completely silent. "Tomorrow morning, the people who actually own this house are going to hear the truth about your plan. And we'll see if they're really on your side when they know what you're actually trying to do." The color visibly drained from her face. She knew I wasn't bluffing. But to understand how we got to that specific moment, to that breaking point, you have to know a little more. My name is David. I'm in my mid-30s, an engineer by trade, and I'd been married to Sarah for 9 years when this whole mess started. We have 2 amazing kids, Noah, who's 7 and asks about a million questions every day, and Chloe, who's 5 and treats our couch like it's a jungle gym. The house we lived in? That technically belonged to Sarah's parents, Robert and Christine. They bought it years ago for estate planning, and we'd been living there since Noah was born. Sarah loved to remind me of that fact, especially during arguments. "You don't actually own anything here," she'd say. Or, "This isn't really your house." And looking back now, I realize she wasn't just winning fights. She was testing how much leverage she actually had. The first real red flag came about 6 months before everything exploded, when this guy, Ben, started appearing in conversations. Sarah said he was an old college friend she'd reconnected with at some alumni event. At first, I didn't think much of it. We'd both stayed in touch with old friends. But then her phone habits changed completely overnight. She started keeping it face down constantly, turned off all her notifications. Whenever I'd walk into a room, she'd flip the screen away like I was trying to access classified information. Her excuses got progressively weirder, too. She'd claim her battery was dying when it showed 70%. Or she'd say she was at the gym, but her location sharing would be conveniently turned off. I'm an engineer. Instead of confronting her based on gut feelings, I started tracking patterns and logging inconsistencies, when she'd leave, when she'd return, what excuses she'd give. Pretty quickly, the timeline stopped adding up to anything legitimate. We were having Sunday dinner at Robert and Christine's place when Sarah casually dropped a bomb in front of everyone. She said something like, if David and I ever split up, obviously I'd stay in the house with the kids, and he'd figure something out elsewhere. She wasn't even looking at me when she said it. She was looking directly at her parents, like a lawyer presenting opening arguments to a jury. Robert and Christine both went quiet for a second, but then Christine changed the subject to Noah's school project, and the moment passed without anyone addressing what she'd actually just said. The next major piece fell into place because of Noah. Kids are terrible at keeping secrets, and he had absolutely no idea he was dropping a bomb when we were driving home from school one day. He just randomly mentioned that Mom's friend Ben took us for ice cream last week and let me get 2 scoops. I asked him when this happened, trying to keep my voice completely normal, and he said it was on the afternoon Sarah told me she was taking them to the park. Sarah overheard from the front seat and jumped in immediately with, "It wasn't just Ben. It was a whole group thing. Don't make it weird, David." But Noah hadn't mentioned any group. He'd specifically said Mom's friend Ben. And I realized Ben wasn't just some distant reconnection anymore. He was already operating inside our family's perimeter, with access to my kids. I didn't confront her right then because I was still in information-gathering mode. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Around 2 in the morning, I got up to get water. Sarah's phone was charging on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with a notification, and I saw it clearly before it disappeared. The message preview said, "Tomorrow we talk about moving you in." And it was from Ben. I took a photo of the screen with my own phone. My hands were completely steady. I went back to bed without saying a single word. That message told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't just having some emotional affair. She'd already written the entire script for my exit and Ben's entrance. And apparently, I was the only person who hadn't received a copy of the revised production schedule. Sarah took the kids to what she called the park on Saturday afternoon, but her location sharing mysteriously stopped working. My calls went straight to voicemail. And when I checked our shared family calendar, I noticed she'd blocked out time for brunch plans near Ben's neighborhood the following weekend. I drove past his apartment complex Sunday morning around 9. Not because I'm some jealous psycho, but because I needed to confirm whether I was losing my mind or if this was actually real. And her car was parked right outside his building. She came home around noon, acting completely normal, asking me how my morning was, talking casually about maybe taking the kids to her parents' house for an overnight visit. I just nodded along while my brain cataloged every single lie. The kids ended up staying at Robert and Christine's house that night without any advance notice to me. Sarah just texted, "They're sleeping at my parents'. I need a break." Like she was entitled to make unilateral decisions about our children's location. And that brings us back to Monday night, when she walked in and laid out her plan. The next morning, I got in my car and drove straight to Robert's office downtown. His building was one of those older structures with marble floors and brass fixtures, the kind of place that still felt serious and formal. I didn't call ahead because I knew if I did, Sarah would somehow find out and get to them first with her version of events. The receptionist told me Robert was in a meeting, but I said I'd wait. About 20 minutes later, she came back and said he could see me. When I walked into his office, Christine was already sitting there, too. They both looked concerned, rather than annoyed, like they'd sensed something serious was coming. I sat down across from Robert's desk and told them I needed to show them some things and I just needed them to listen without interrupting until I was completely finished. Robert nodded and leaned back in his chair. Christine folded her hands in her lap. I pulled out my phone and started laying out the timeline, exactly like I was presenting an engineering failure analysis report. I showed them the photo of Ben's text message about moving in. I showed them the shared calendar with the brunch reservation near his apartment. I pulled up our phone account records showing dozens of calls between Sarah and Ben at odd hours over the past 6 months. And I explained about Noah accidentally mentioning the ice cream trip that Sarah had explicitly lied about. I told them Sarah's exact words from the night before, how she planned to stay in the house with the kids and move Ben in once I left, and how she'd specifically said, "My parents will understand that I need support." The room was completely silent. Robert's expression got progressively harder with every piece of evidence. Christine's face just looked sad and exhausted, like she'd been dreading this exact conversation for years. When I finished, Robert didn't explode or accuse me of lying. He didn't reflexively jump to his daughter's defense the way Sarah had predicted. Instead, he looked at Christine and said, "This is what we were afraid of." Christine nodded slowly. Then she looked directly at me and said something that made my stomach drop. "We found messages between Sarah and Ben about 3 years ago when we borrowed her laptop. We confronted her, and she swore it was over. She promised us she'd cut all contact and focus on her family." I just sat there, processing the fact that this situation had been going on for years rather than months, and that her parents already knew Ben wasn't just some innocent old college friend. Robert stood up and walked to the window. He was quiet for maybe 30 seconds, just looking out at the city. Then he turned around and said the house was supposed to provide stability for their grandchildren. It was never meant to be leveraged for this kind of situation. He said Sarah could make whatever choices she wanted about her marriage, but she absolutely wasn't going to use their property to facilitate moving her boyfriend in with their grandkids. Christine added that they'd been watching Sarah's behavior change over the past year, the secretiveness, the attitude, the way she'd started treating me like I was temporary or disposable. They'd hoped she'd come to her senses, but clearly that hadn't happened. Robert said we were going to handle this as a family meeting that night at 7. Everyone at the house. Sarah needed to hear directly from them that her plan wasn't going to work the way she thought it would. Christine told me to be there and to stay calm, no matter what Sarah said, because she was going to absolutely explode when she realized her parents weren't backing her play. Sarah came home around 5 with groceries, like it was just another regular evening. She was humming to herself, talking about what to make for dinner. I didn't say anything about where I'd been or what was coming in 2 hours. At exactly 7, Robert and Christine showed up. Sarah opened the door with this big, welcoming smile, thinking they were just stopping by. But her expression changed immediately when she saw how serious they both looked. Robert said, "We need to talk. Everyone sit down right now." And Sarah's smile faded completely. She sat on the couch looking confused and slightly annoyed, probably thinking I'd called them over to complain about the divorce. Robert didn't waste any time with small talk or pleasantries. He said, "We know about Ben. We know about your plan to move him into this house. And we know you've been lying to all of us for years." Sarah's face went through about 5 different expressions in 3 seconds: shock, panic, anger, all fighting for control. Then she strategically landed on tears. She started crying and saying I'd twisted everything and taken things out of context and that Ben was just a friend who was helping her through a difficult time in her marriage. Christine just shook her head and said, "We saw the messages, Sarah, the same way we saw them 3 years ago when you promised us it was over." Sarah switched tactics immediately. The tears dried up instantly. And she started yelling about how they were choosing me over their own daughter. How could they possibly believe some outsider instead of their own blood? She was actually screaming at them, saying things like, "I'm your child, and you're supposed to support me no matter what I do. And if you kick me out, I'll make sure you never see your grandkids again." That's when Robert's expression went completely cold. He's usually this warm, grandfatherly type, but right then, he looked like a judge handing down a life sentence. He told Sarah that if she wanted to involve Child Protective Services or make threats about the grandkids, she should be fully prepared to explain to those authorities why she wanted to move her boyfriend into a house that didn't belong to her while her minor children were living there. Sarah's brain seemed to completely freeze. You could actually see the moment she realized her nuclear option would blow up directly in her own face. Christine said, "You're going to pack your essential things tonight, and you're going to leave. David and the children are staying here, and Ben is never setting foot in this house." Sarah tried to argue, but Robert cut her off. He said the house was legally in their name, and they could decide who lived there, and their decision was final. Sarah looked at me like she expected me to say something or gloat or get into a fight with her. But I just sat there quietly, because this genuinely wasn't my conversation to have. This was between her and the consequences of her own choices. She stood up and screamed that we'd all regret this and that she'd get a lawyer and take everything. Then she stormed to the bedroom and started violently throwing things into suitcases. The sound of drawers slamming and hangers scraping echoed through the entire house. Noah called from upstairs, asking what was happening. Christine went up to reassure him while Robert and I just waited in the living room, listening to Sarah's complete meltdown. She came out 20 minutes later with 2 suitcases and a garbage bag stuffed with clothes, mascara running down her face in dark streaks. She looked at her parents one final time like she was waiting for them to change their minds. When they didn't say anything, she walked out and slammed the door so violently that a picture frame fell off the wall. We heard her car engine start and tires screech as she peeled out of the driveway. And then the house was just eerily quiet. The next few days were strange and tense. Sarah wouldn't answer any of my calls, but she was absolutely blowing up her parents' phones with messages about how betrayed she felt. I found out she'd actually moved in with Ben because a letter showed up for her from the post office about a change of address. When I looked up the address, it was Ben's apartment complex. She'd also apparently put utility bills in her name at that address, which I carefully documented and saved, because I knew we were heading toward a serious legal fight, and I needed proof she'd left voluntarily. Then, exactly 1 week after she moved out, I got a call from Noah's school. The principal said they'd received a concerning safety report from Sarah about unsafe conditions at home, and they were legally required to forward it to Child Protective Services. My stomach dropped because I realized she was going completely scorched earth. She couldn't win through her parents, so now she was trying to weaponize the system against me. The Child Protective Services worker showed up the next afternoon, a tired-looking woman named Rebecca, who'd clearly seen every manipulation tactic in the book during her career. She walked through the entire house, talked to the kids separately in private, asked them detailed questions about their routines and whether they felt safe. Then she sat down with me, Robert, and Christine, who'd rushed over as soon as I called them. Rebecca looked at her notes and said, "I'm marking this as a retaliatory filing. The children are clearly well cared for, and there's no evidence of anything concerning here." She said it happens sometimes in custody disputes where one parent tries to use CPS as a weapon, and it usually backfires very badly in court proceedings. 2 days later, my lawyer called and said Sarah's attorney had filed for emergency temporary custody orders, claiming I was keeping the children from her and creating an unsafe environment. We had a court date scheduled for the following Monday, just 3 days away. My lawyer said to bring every single piece of documentation I had because this was going to get extremely ugly. The courthouse on Monday morning had that specific kind of tension where everyone's pretending to be calm, but you can physically feel the stress radiating off people in waves. Sarah showed up looking completely different from the screaming mess who'd slammed out of the house 2 weeks earlier. She had on this conservative navy dress and minimal makeup, the kind of carefully chosen outfit designed to project responsible mother to a family court judge. Her friend Kelly was with her for moral support, sitting right behind her in the gallery and shooting me genuinely hateful looks, like I was some kind of villain in this story. My lawyer had prepped me extensively on what to expect. He said Sarah's attorney would try to paint me as controlling and possibly dangerous, and that we needed to stay completely calm and let the evidence speak for itself. Sarah's lawyer went first and laid out this whole narrative about how she'd been trapped in an unhappy marriage, how I'd controlled the finances and isolated her from friends, and how she'd finally found the courage to leave, but now I was weaponizing her parents and the house to keep her from her children. She actually teared up while her lawyer was talking, dabbing at her eyes with tissues she'd clearly brought for this purpose. And Kelly nodded along in the background like she was watching some inspiring testimony. When it was our turn, my lawyer didn't waste any time with emotional appeals. He just started methodically laying out documentation like he was building a brick wall, one piece at a time. He showed the change of address form Sarah had filed with the post office, listing Ben's apartment. He showed the utility bills she'd put in her name at that same address. And he presented a clear timeline showing she'd moved out completely voluntarily before any custody orders even existed. Then he pulled up the screenshot of Ben's text message about moving in, and he asked the judge to note that Sarah had actively planned to move her boyfriend into a house where minor children resided, a house that didn't belong to her, without any discussion whatsoever with their father or the actual property owners. He presented the local elementary school record showing Ben had already been around the kids without my knowledge or consent, which Sarah had lied about repeatedly. My lawyer also submitted the CPS report showing the investigation had been marked retaliatory and completely unfounded, and he pointed out that filing false reports was a serious issue that spoke directly to Sarah's judgment and credibility. Then Robert took the stand, and that's when things really shifted in the courtroom. He explained that he and Christine had purchased the house specifically as a stable environment for their grandchildren, that it was part of their long-term estate planning, and that they'd made the decision to have me and the kids remain there because stability was the absolute priority. The judge asked Robert directly whether he and his wife supported their daughter having primary custody, and Robert said something I'll genuinely never forget. He said, "We support our grandchildren having consistency, and we support the parent who chose to stay with them over the parent who chose to leave." The judge made it very clear this was a temporary emergency order pending a full custody hearing in 60 days, but her reasoning was specific and direct. She said temporary primary residence would be with me at the house owned by the grandparents. Sarah would have supervised visitation every other weekend, plus one evening during the week, and Ben was prohibited from being around the children for a minimum of 6 months while Sarah demonstrated actual stability. The judge also noted that any future attempts to file false CPS reports or make unsubstantiated allegations would result in an immediate reduction of custody time, and she strongly encouraged both parties to focus on co-parenting rather than continued conflict. Sarah looked like she'd been physically slapped. Her mouth was actually hanging open. When we walked out into the courthouse corridor, she completely lost it. She started screaming at me right there in the hallway, with court officers actively watching, yelling about how I'd stolen her life and turned her own parents against her and ruined absolutely everything. I didn't yell back. I just told her very calmly that she'd given up her life when she decided to move her boyfriend into bedrooms where our kids slept. And then I walked away while she was still screaming. Kelly had to physically pull her toward the exit before security actually got involved. And I heard Sarah sobbing all the way down the hall. The social media war started that same night. Sarah posted this long, tearful message about being a mother torn from her children by a vindictive ex and complicit in-laws. And Kelly was in the comments aggressively fighting anyone who dared ask reasonable questions about why Sarah had moved out or who Ben actually was. I didn't respond publicly because my lawyer explicitly told me not to engage. But I did post one single sentence that said, "Some people leave their family long before they physically walk out the door." That post got shared by people who knew us, and the narrative started genuinely cracking when Olivia showed up in the comments. Olivia had been Sarah's absolute best friend since college. They'd been completely inseparable for years, but they'd had some major falling out around the time Ben reappeared, and I'd never known the exact reason why. Olivia wrote this comment that said, "I watched her plan this for months. She wanted to have her new relationship completely set up before leaving, and now she's shocked there were consequences." People started asking Olivia questions, and she answered some of them. Nothing cruel or overly detailed, but enough to make it crystal clear Sarah's victim story didn't match reality. The comment section turned from supportive to deeply skeptical really fast. People were asking why Sarah had left if she wanted her kids so badly, why she'd moved in with a boyfriend immediately, whether she'd been cheating throughout the marriage. Sarah couldn't answer those questions without admitting things she didn't want to admit, so she just started frantically deleting comments and blocking people, which made her look even worse. Then, about a week later, Ben posted a photo with some new woman. They were at a restaurant looking very much like a couple, and the caption was something about finally drama-free. He didn't mention Sarah at all. Didn't even acknowledge she existed. And you could tell from the comments that people who knew him were genuinely congratulating him on getting out of whatever mess he'd been involved in. Sarah showed up at the house 3 days after that. Kelly was with her again, and she asked if we could talk about finding closure and maybe working toward fixing things. She actually said, "Most men would have fought for me," like she expected me to be devastated that she'd moved on or begging for another chance. I told her very clearly that I hadn't fought for her. I'd fought for our children's safety and stability, and those were two completely different things. She tried to keep talking, but I closed the door. Not angrily, just finally. I watched through the window as she stood on the porch, looking genuinely confused, before Kelly led her back to the car. The final piece fell into place 2 months later when Robert and Christine officially put the house into a trust for Noah and Chloe, with me designated as the trustee and occupant until they turned 18. Sarah tried to fight it through her lawyer, but there was literally nothing to fight. It was their property and their decision to make. She actually showed up at Robert's office demanding to know how they could do this to her. Apparently, she made such a scene that building security had to escort her out. Looking back at this entire situation, the biggest lesson is about the difference between reacting emotionally and responding strategically. Sarah made every decision based on what she wanted in the moment. She never thought about long-term consequences or how her actions would look under scrutiny. Meanwhile, documenting everything and staying calm turned out to be the most powerful response possible, because manipulators absolutely rely on you losing control so they can play the victim. The second you refuse to play that role, their entire strategy collapses. So, here's what I want to ask you: what's the right balance between defending yourself against someone trying to weaponize systems like the courts against you, and not stooping to their level?